Heavy metal and horror are two worlds built on shock, fear, and rebellion. From the blood-splattered screens of slasher films to the skull-covered vinyls of metal legends, these two cultural forces have danced together for decades. But how did horror cinema become so deeply woven into the DNA of metal music? In this video, we'll uncover the long, twisted relationship between metal and horror. We'll trace it back to classic films, break down iconic album art, and hear how horror inspired entire subgenres of metal. Before metal even existed, horror movies were already terrifying audiences worldwide. In the early 20th century, universal monsters like Frankenstein and Dracula gave people their first cinematic nightmares. And though metal hadn't been born yet, these figures planted the visual seeds. Darkness, gothic castles, graveyards, and blood-soaked drama. By the 1960s and 70s, horror films became darker and more violent, just as rock music was evolving into something heavier. Black Sabbath's 1970 debut was arguably the first true metal album, and it was directly inspired by horror. The band took their name from a Boris Karloff horror film. They used tritones, also known as the Devil's Interval, which was used often in horror scores, to make their riffs sound unsettling. The lyrics were full of supernatural terror, satanic imagery, and creeping paranoia. Ozzy Osbourne was quoted as saying, "We saw people queuing up for horror movies. We thought, what if we made music that made people feel the same way?" That one decision opened the door for an entire genre of music to embrace fear as art. In the late 70s and early 80s, horror got bloodier. The slasher boom brought villains like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger into pop culture. Their masks, weapons, and brutal kills were shocking and irresistible to metal fans. Metal took notes. Just like horror films use gore and surprise to jolt audiences, metal used distortion, evil lyrics, and theatricality to stand out. Iron Maiden's Eddie Mascot took cues from zombie horror. Slayer used satanic imagery and war violence like it was pulled straight out of a horror movie. And King Diamond, well, he was practically a horror movie villain on stage. Horror and metal both thrived on pushing boundaries. Parents hated them, politicians tried to censor them, and that only made kids love them more. As MTV exploded in the 80s, metal bands started thinking like horror directors. Music videos became short horror films. Metallica's one pulled from the anti-war nightmare film Johnny Got His Gun. Cradle of Filth made Gothic Victorian horror the basis for their entire visual identity. And Rob Zombie, he didn't just love horror, he became a horror filmmaker, directing films like A House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects. Rob Zombie's quoted as saying, "Growing up on horror, it always made sense to combine it with heavy music. They're both about tapping into something primal, something that scares you but also excites you." Horror gave metal a language of visual storytelling, a way to build myth, menace, and madness into the music. As metal splintered into subgenres, horror's influence deepened. Black metal borrowed from occult horror with corpse paint, pentagrams, and lyrics about demons and darkness, and Norwegian black metal bands like Mayhem and Emperor turned stage shows into ritualistic horror experiences. Death metal took things further, with guttural vocals and grotesque lyrics inspired by horror films and splatter films as well. Bands like Cannibal Corpse and Autopsy built entire discographies around murder, mutilation, and undead carnage. Meanwhile, horror fandom exploded in the underground. While tape trading, fanzines, and bootlegs were popular in metal, they were also popular in horror. Metalheads and horror nerds were often the same people, trading gore for riffs and vice versa. Whether it was vampires, zombies, serial killers, or Satan himself, horror became the muse for some of metal's darkest, most creative expressions. In the 2000s and beyond, horror evolved. It became more psychological, more existential, and metal followed. Bands like Slipknot built personas around trauma, madness, and inner demons. Ghost took theatrical horror and blended it with religious satire. Motionless in White leaned into gothic Tim Burton-style visual horror. Even progressive metal bands like Tool and Opeth drew on Lovecraftian dread, surrealism, and psychological tension, much like modern horror films. Today, horror isn't just blood and guts. It's about what haunts us, our fears of death, isolation, madness, and the unknown. And metal remains the perfect soundtrack for all of it. From Black Sabbath to Cannibal Corpse, from Dracula to Hereditary, horror and heavy metal have always been connected by more than just imagery. They're both about facing fear, about finding power in the darkness. So next time you see a screaming skull on a metal album cover or hear a blood-curdling scream in a solo, remember, it's not just music, it's cinema, it's art. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like if you enjoyed. Check me out on TikTok. We have metal discussions there every day at Play It on Repeat Pod. Thanks again for watching. Bye.